Magnus Elvar thought he was flying to Manila to meet the love that revived his lonely heart. But Serena Kaile's secret was only the first truth. Behind her stood a network of predators, rival hunters, and a storm of danger waiting to devour them both. Magnus Elvar had spent 6 decades building a life that most people could only dream of. His fortune was made through sharp instincts and relentless discipline in Dubai's real estate world, transforming barren stretches of sand into towers of glass. Yet, despite all his accomplishments, the one thing he could never construct was a sense of companionship. His penthouse was vast, elegant, and filled with rare artworks, but silence echoed through it louder than any sound. As the years passed, loneliness became the only constant, making itself at home in the empty spaces of his nights. It was during one of those nights that he discovered Serena Kaile's message. At first, it was a simple greeting, nothing remarkable, but something about her wording carried warmth that he had not felt in years. Serena presented herself as a 28-year-old caregiver living in Manila, struggling with long shifts and a simple life. She wasn't interested in his wealth and treated him as though he were simply a man wanting conversation, not a millionaire seeking affection. Magnus found comfort in that. Days turned into weeks, and their exchanges became the highlight of his routine. Her messages arrived at the perfect moments, often when Magnus felt most alone, and she seemed to understand him in a way no one else had in decades. She sent photos that showed a modest life and videos filled with laughter that felt genuine to him. The more she shared about her hardships, the more Magnus felt compelled to help her. He began sending money to assist with medical bills, rent, and family problems she claimed were overwhelming her. His accountant expressed concern when the amounts grew, but Magnus brushed aside the warnings. This connection made him feel alive again, and he believed that genuine love sometimes required trust beyond logic. For the first time in years, he envisioned a future not defined by business deals, but by companionship. When Serena mentioned wanting to meet him in person, Magnus felt something inside him awaken. He booked first-class flights, arranged a week-long stay at a luxury hotel in Manila, and purchased gifts he felt would show his sincerity. As he prepared for the journey, an unspoken excitement pulsed through him, the kind he hadn't felt since his youth. The idea of finally meeting the woman who had reshaped his days filled him with a sense of renewal. But reality began to shift the moment he arrived. Manila was nothing like Serena had described. He expected a quiet neighborhood, yet he was met with chaotic streets, crowded alleys, and people watching him with guarded eyes. He assumed she had downplayed her environment out of embarrassment, convincing himself that love required patience. Still, a subtle unease lingered beneath his optimism. When he reached the building Serena supposedly lived in, a narrow 3-story rental complex, he was greeted by Talia Harris, a neighbor who seemed hesitant as she opened the gate. She studied him carefully before explaining that Serena was upstairs preparing for his visit. Magnus felt a mix of nerves and anticipation as he climbed the steep staircase, each step echoing in the narrow hallway. He expected warmth, a welcoming smile, perhaps even tears of happiness. Instead, he found tension thickening the moment he entered her room. Serena stood near the window, her posture rigid, eyes filled with something far more complicated than nervous excitement. The room was dim, its single bulb flickering, casting unsteady shadows across the walls. Magnus noticed her trembling, as if she feared something far greater than disappointing him. In those first few minutes, her carefully built narrative began unraveling. She revealed truths she had hidden from him, truths about her identity, her past, and the life she had never disclosed through the screen. Magnus learned she had been born male and had concealed this from him entirely. But as the shock struck him, he sensed an even deeper layer of deceit. Serena's fear was not rooted solely in their relationship. There were hints of another presence in her life, someone she felt compelled to obey, someone's shadow stretched into every corner of that cramped room. Magnus realized that the woman he thought he knew was tangled in dangers that went far beyond a romantic lie, and his arrival had triggered a chain of events he was unprepared to confront.
Magnus felt the weight of Serena's confession sink into him with a cold heaviness, but the shock was only the beginning. As he stood in that dim room, he noticed details that hadn't been visible during their online conversations. Her clothes were neatly folded but limited, as though they belonged to someone who moved often. Her bags were half-packed. There were no personal decorations, no photos, no signs of a settled life. It was as if Serena lived inside a temporary shell, always ready to disappear. What unsettled him most was how her eyes kept darting toward the door, as if she were expecting someone or fearing someone's arrival. Magnus attempted to collect himself, reminding his mind that people sometimes resorted to complex deceptions out of fear, shame, or survival. Yet beneath that reasoning, a sense of danger slowly curled around him like smoke. He observed Serena's trembling hands, her shoulders tense, the way her breath hitched with every sound from the hallway. Each movement hinted at pressure from an unseen force, something far more threatening than a romantic betrayal. Her fear was not of Magnus, it was directed at something beyond him. Talia Maris, the neighbor who had let him in, remained standing at the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but her posture suggested she wanted to leave quickly. Magnus felt her studying him, calculating something silently. When she finally stepped back into the hall, she muttered a brief warning about the neighborhood and walked away without looking back. Her hurried exit stirred Magnus's unease further. He sensed that Talia knew more about Serena's circumstances than she dared to say. Serena, still unable to steady her breathing, began to explain fragments of her situation. Much of her life online had been curated to earn Magnus's affection and support, but the real reason went deeper. She was trapped under the control of someone named Kaile Soren, a figure Magnus had never heard of. Serena described him as a manipulative handler who targeted vulnerable individuals to lure wealthy foreigners under the promise of romance. Her role had been to build emotional connections, secure financial support, and eventually bring victims to Manila under the guise of meeting in person. Once they arrived, Kaile would take over. Magnus felt his stomach tighten. He realized that his heart had led him into something organized and dangerous. Serena insisted she had tried to step back from Kaile's operations, and that was why she seemed so afraid. She revealed that Kaile had been monitoring her conversations, making sure she followed the plan. But in recent months, she had genuinely developed feelings for Magnus and no longer wanted to be part of the scheme. Her fear was not just for him, it was for herself. Kaile was known for punishing disobedience in ways that left no trace. Magnus struggled to reconcile the gentle image he had formed of Serena with the precarious world she described. He felt a strange blend of sympathy and dread. He had expected an emotional meeting, perhaps disappointment, but nothing like this. He had walked into someone else's war without realizing it. The sounds from the hallway grew louder, a distant clang, hurried footsteps, a door slamming somewhere below. Serena flinched with every noise, her entire body tightening as though anticipating violence. Magnus's instincts, finely tuned from years of negotiation and risk assessment, told him that staying there was dangerous. He suggested leaving the room and going somewhere public where she might feel safer, but Serena shook her head in panic. She whispered that Kaile knew Magnus had arrived and would come soon. There was no safe escape unless they moved quickly and quietly. Magnus felt adrenaline rising. He had traveled thousands of miles seeking companionship, but now he found himself caught in a trap woven by desperation and fear.
Serena's guilt was clear, but so was her terror. Everything she had withheld had brought him to this moment, standing on the threshold of an unfolding threat neither of them fully understood. And as the hallway fell eerily silent, Magnus sensed that the real danger was only just beginning to close in around them.
Magnus's pulse hammered as the silence in the hallway stretched into something heavy and unnatural. The air in Serena's room felt thick, as if the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Serena moved to the window, not to look outside, but merely to listen. Every muscle in her body appeared tight with dread. Magnus saw that she feared not just confrontation, but a punishment she had endured before. The emotional weight in her movements hinted that Kaile Soren was someone who thrived on creating invisible scars. Magnus tried to understand how deeply Serena had been trapped in this life. Her online charm had never revealed the frightened person standing before him now, someone shaped by survival rather than choice. She had been drawn into Kaile's operations years earlier when her financial instability and social vulnerability made her an easy target. What started as a simple job to meet tourists eventually became something darker. Kaile discovered how profitable the emotional manipulation of wealthy foreigners could be, especially when the victims believed they were forming real connections. Serena had resisted at first, but Kaile controlled her through threats, intimidation, and the constant reminder that she had nowhere else to go. As Serena revealed more about Kaile's network, Magnus understood that he had stepped into an operation far bigger than he imagined. Kaile employed multiple individuals scattered across Manila, some willingly, others trapped like Serena. They lured foreigners into the city and isolated them before taking money, passports, and sometimes more. The victims rarely contacted authorities because shame often kept them silent. Magnus felt a wave of disgust, not toward Serena, but toward the man who had exploited her vulnerabilities and used her identity as leverage. A sudden thud came from below, sharp, deliberate. Serena stiffened, her breath held in her throat. Magnus felt ice crawl down his spine. The footsteps that followed were slow, controlled, echoing through the narrow stairwell. Whoever was approaching had no reason to hide their presence. Magnus realized Kaile wanted Serena to know he was coming. Fear, for him, was a tool. The door to the building creaked loudly, its rusty hinges giving away the intruder's location. Serena backed toward Magnus, her hands shaking. She whispered that Kaile often arrived without warning, but this time would be different. Serena had disobeyed him by confessing the truth to Magnus, and Kaile would not tolerate disloyalty. Magnus's instincts shifted from confusion to survival. He scanned the room for anything that could help them. There was a small suitcase, a stool, and a desk cluttered with scattered documents, nothing that could protect them from someone who had built a career on intimidation and control. The footsteps reached the second floor. Magnus heard a brief conversation between Talia and the intruder, muffled, tense. Talia's voice carried fear, not resistance, as though she had no power to stop what was coming. The fear in her tone confirmed to Magnus that Kaile ruled the building itself. Everyone knew him. Everyone feared him. Serena moved to the corner of the room, as though hiding would make her invisible. Magnus felt helpless watching her shrink into her fear. She had spent years under Kaile's shadow, always waiting for the next command, the next punishment. Her courage to confess the truth to Magnus now seemed like a risk that could cost her everything. The footsteps paused right outside the door. Magnus felt the air leave his chest. The doorknob turned slowly, as if Kaile wanted them to feel every second of the moment. But then, nothing. The knob stopped moving. A long silence followed. Just when Magnus thought Kaile might break down the door, another sound interrupted them, a loud crash from the floor below, followed by hurried voices. It wasn't clear whether someone had fallen or whether something unexpected had happened. The commotion grew rapidly, echoing through the building. Serena's eyes widened. She recognized the voices. They belonged to two individuals who worked under Kaile,
but they sounded panicked rather than controlled. Kale's calm footsteps never entered the room. Instead, he moved back down the stairs, shouting orders in a low, furious tone. Something had gone wrong, something Kale had not anticipated. Serena whispered that disruptions like this never happened. Kale ruled his operations with rigid precision. Any chaos meant someone, somewhere, had broken his chain of control. For the first time since Magnus arrived, Serena's fear mixed with confusion. Magnus sensed an opportunity. If Kale was distracted, they might have a small window to escape. But as they listened to the chaos below, it became clear that whatever had disrupted Kale's plans was not a rescue, not an accident. It was something far more dangerous unfolding beneath them, something that could sweep them both into an even darker storm.
Serena remained frozen, her eyes darting toward the door as the noise downstairs intensified. Magnus could hear furniture scraping, footsteps rushing, and the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Whatever had disrupted Kyle's calculated entrance was violent and unexpected. The entire building felt as if it were shifting under the weight of a conflict none of them had foreseen. Magnus's instincts urged him to move, but Serena's panic held her in place, a reflex conditioned by years of fear. He reached for her arm gently, guiding her toward the far corner of the room, away from the door. She followed mechanically, her thoughts clearly racing. Downstairs, a sharp metallic clang rang out, followed by a man shouting in pain. Serena whispered the names of Kyle's two associates, Drevin and Amesh, men who did most of his dirty work. Hearing their panic unsettled her in a way Magnus had not yet seen. These were individuals Serena described as cruel and fearless, yet now they sounded frantic, scrambling for control. Something far more dangerous than Kyle had descended on the building. A sudden silence bloomed downstairs. It was the kind of silence that follows something catastrophic, the kind that makes the air feel colder. Magnus could almost feel the tension pulsing through the thin walls. Serena pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. She whispered that Kyle never allowed chaos among his people. His operations depended on control. For this level of disorder to erupt meant an intruder had stepped into Kyle's territory, someone bold or reckless enough to confront him directly. Then came footsteps again, these faster, heavier, lacking the calculated rhythm of Kyle's approach. Someone was moving up the stairs with urgency, not stealth. Magnus felt his heart pound as the figure ascended. Serena pulled him behind the wardrobe, the largest object in the room, offering a thin shield. Magnus crouched beside her, listening. He had no weapon, no plan, only the instinct to keep Serena hidden until he understood what threat approached. The unknown figure reached their floor. A door slammed roughly nearby, followed by the sound of someone searching rooms without hesitation. This person wasn't Kyle. He never moved with desperate energy. Magnus realized the intruder must be part of something larger, perhaps a rival to Kyle's operation. Manila's underground world was far more complex than Magnus had understood, and Kyle's predatory schemes had surely earned him enemies. The footsteps stopped right outside Serena's door. Magnus braced himself. He gripped the edge of the wardrobe, his muscles tense. Serena closed her eyes, whispering a silent plea. The doorknob rattled, then twisted forcefully. The door swung open so hard it slammed against the wall. Heavy boots stepped inside. A man's breathing filled the room, slow, steady, unfamiliar. Papers rustled, drawers were pulled out violently. The intruder searched as though he knew exactly what he wanted. Magnus kept Serena pressed behind him, shielding her as best he could. Sweat collected on his palms. They could not move without being detected. Every breath felt like a risk. Then, just as suddenly, the boots retreated. The man stepped back into the hallway and moved into the next room. Magnus allowed only the smallest exhale. He knew they weren't safe, not yet.
The building had become a battlefield between forces he didn't recognize. Staying meant waiting for Kyle to regain control or for the new threat to return. Serena tugged lightly at Magnus's sleeve, urging him toward the window. It overlooked a narrow alley, cluttered but accessible. She explained with trembling urgency that if Kyle regained control, they would be trapped, and if the intruder found them, the outcome might be even worse. Magnus hesitated only a moment before realizing she was right. Together they moved toward the window. Serena pushed it open with shaky hands, the rusted hinges groaning. The drop was significant, but survivable. Magnus checked the alley, empty for now. He helped Serena through first, lowering her as far as he could. When her feet touched the ground, she signaled for him to follow. Magnus climbed out, gripping the ledge just as voices erupted again inside the building. Kyle's fury now unmistakable, roaring like a storm reclaiming its territory. Magnus jumped down beside Serena. They had escaped the room, but not the danger. The alley stretched ahead, dark and uncertain. The air smelled of smoke and damp concrete. Serena pointed toward a narrow passageway that connected to a busier street. Magnus nodded. They started running, every step taking them deeper into a maze of unknown risks. Behind them, Kyle's empire was cracking, and its collapse was sending shockwaves that followed them into the night. Whatever Serena had feared was no longer the only threat. Something larger had been set into motion, and Magnus realized their escape was only the beginning of a much darker journey.
Magnus and Serena ran through the narrow alley, their footsteps echoing against the concrete walls as darkness pressed in from every side. The deeper they went, the more the sounds of chaos from the building faded behind them, replaced by the hum of traffic and distant voices from the main street. Yet even as they reached the relative safety of a more crowded area, Magnus sensed the danger still breathing down their necks. Serena, panting and trembling, kept glancing over her shoulder. She had spent years under Kyle's command. She knew that escape was never as simple as running. The street they emerged onto was busy enough to mask their presence. Vendors sold food under flickering bulbs, jeepneys rattled by, and groups of people moved in unpredictable patterns. The noise should have comforted them, but Serena remained on edge. She pulled Magnus into the shadow of a small shop, trying to conceal themselves behind a stack of crates. She whispered that Kyle had contacts across Manila, drivers, porters, even some local vendors. Simply blending into the crowd wouldn't be enough. Magnus looked around, searching for a direction that offered a shred of safety. Every corner seemed suspicious, every figure potentially dangerous. His mind raced with possibilities. Hotels would require identification, public transport would be risky, and wandering at night left them vulnerable. Serena revealed that Kyle monitored the areas around his operations, sometimes even paying beggars or street kids to act as lookouts. Magnus realized they were still very much in Kyle's territory. As they tried to steady their breaths, a subtle shift in the atmosphere made Serena tense again. A man stepped onto the street from the alley they had just escaped, someone Magnus didn't recognize. The man's eyes scanned the crowd with precision, searching in predatory sweeps. His posture was sharp, alert, and he moved with the confidence of someone who expected results. Serena whispered that this wasn't Kyle or one of his usual men. This was likely someone connected to the intruder who disrupted Kyle's operation earlier. That meant they weren't just running from Kyle, they were caught between two forces. Magnus knew they had minutes, maybe seconds, before the stranger's gaze swept over their hiding spot. They had to move. Serena pointed toward a narrow side street leading toward a small community she once stayed in before Kyle pulled her deeper into his network. It wasn't safe, she warned, but it was less predictable. Magnus agreed, and together they slipped into the side street, keeping low and moving quickly but quietly. The area ahead grew quieter as they left the busy street behind. Dim lights cast uneven shadows across old homes and rusted gates. A stray dog barked in the distance. The tension in the air felt different here, less chaotic, more watchful. Serena led Magnus through a maze of back alleys, her memory guiding her despite the years. Every turn felt like threading a needle between danger and temporary sanctuary. They reached a small abandoned warehouse at the edge of the neighborhood. Serena explained that she used to hide there during her early days in Manila. Magnus hesitated. Abandoned places often meant risks, but the urgency of their situation left him with little choice. He followed her inside. The interior was dusty and dim, with broken windows allowing faint moonlight to spill across the concrete floor. They settled behind an old storage rack, catching their breaths. For a brief moment, Magnus allowed himself to feel relief. It was fragile, but it was something. Then Serena's voice trembled as she revealed a truth she had kept hidden. Kaile had her personal information, her real identity, her family's address, and the details of every foreigner she interacted with. Magnus realized his own information, given willingly during their months of online connection, was likely recorded somewhere in Kaile's files. Kaile wouldn't just seek Serena, he would seek Magnus too. Not for emotional betrayal, but for disrupting a profitable operation. Magnus's relief vanished. He understood now that leaving Manila would be far more dangerous than arriving. Kaile controlled travel routes, bribed airport staff, and monitored foreign clients closely. Magnus was no longer a visitor, he was a target. Escaping the city would require more than hiding. They needed help, someone outside Kaile's reach. Serena mentioned one possibility, a distant figure known for helping those trapped in criminal networks, someone Kaile feared but couldn't control. She hadn't contacted this person before, because doing so risked Kaile's wrath. But now, with everything unraveling and rival forces emerging, he was their only hope. Magnus looked at her, realizing their path forward would be filled with even deeper dangers. The night outside grew darker, and the warehouse seemed to shrink around them. They had escaped one threat, only to find themselves entangled in a far more complex web. Their journey was no longer about fleeing. It was about outsmarting an entire underground system and surviving long enough to reach the one person who might turn the tide.